I'm here in place of Ian Jacobs. Ian Jacobs would love to have done this for Jenny as well. Unfortunately, Ian's in town meeting with a government minister at the moment, Minister Stokes, along with the Vice-Chancellors of Newcastle and Wollongong as well, about the very exciting new alliance. These inaugural professorial lectures are one of the most important events in UNSW's calendar. It gives us an opportunity to celebrate the life and achievements of our star performers. To achieve the position of professor at University of New South Wales is one of the highest academic accolades that anyone can achieve. So we're delighted to be able to celebrate in the success of these people. Today it's our pleasure to welcome Jenny Buchan to this august list of people. And also in particular because while Jenny's made many magnificent achievements, she's been helped along that route by many important people. And as a result, we're delighted to welcome here today our husband Graham and his son, and their son Ian. Ian, I think, is graduating today as well at 6:30 with in Chinese studies. So I think a round of a hand. From Melbourne, we'd like to welcome our daughter Tamsin and her boyfriend John. And from New Zealand, her sister Sue and niece Audrey. And from the US, her brother Mike. So I think, Jenny, you've probably assembled the most geographically diverse group of people for any professorial lecture. So I think without further ado, I'd like to hand over to the Dean, Professor Chris Stiles, to give an introduction to Jenny.
Well, good afternoon, everyone, and thank you very much, Brian. Clearly, we all shop at the same place. But some of us perhaps look better than others in it. So welcome to this professorial lecture. They are very important and a landmark, I think, moment in our lives. We are sort of pushed for time a little bit, and I think most of it should be spent with Jenny telling us a bit about her work. So a very, very brief introduction. Jenny joined the School of Taxation and Business Law in 2002. Prior to becoming an academic, she worked as a commercial lawyer in private practice in New Zealand, Melbourne and Sydney, and as a compliance consultant. She's a highly engaged academic with a wide range of experience in academia, industry and legal practice. And I guess there's two things I wanted to highlight in her time here, where she's done many, many things. One is in her research, and she really is a global pioneer in franchising and franchise law, and has all the challenges with being a pioneer, and has done a fantastic job. And the second thing is that she created the faculty's first MOOC, a massive open online course in franchise law, which has done fantastically well. And I guess both those things are really showing that Jenny is a real innovator in the way she approaches things. And last year she went through the process, which is a very tough process, becoming a professor, Spanish Inquisition-like process of becoming a professor here, and very proudly got through that process and became a professor at UNSW. And it's my great pleasure to turn over to Jenny now for her talk. Thank you very much.
Thanks, Brian. Thanks, Chris. And thanks, everybody, for coming along. So we're going to hear about my crazy world of franchise law and what got me into it. And I'm not ever sure that I'm going to get out of it. So here I am. I have to use this, apparently. How do we do it? This is not me. Do you know how to work it? That one. This is not... Oh, here we go. Rightio, so look, there's been many great moments along the way, and my favourite way of celebrating anything that I've got to sort of go, phew, got that one behind me, is to go bush, to go right off the grid. So here you'll see when I handed in my PhD in 2010, Graham and I walked across the Simpson Desert with some camels, and 200 dunes later, I think I was feeling a whole lot better. And then those mountains are on South Georgia Island in the South Atlantic. So when I was promoted to associate professor, I headed off on a small yacht and with 12 other people, and sailed from the Falklands to South Georgia Island and back. And it was just like living in David Attenborough for the whole 4 weeks. It was quite extraordinary. So what on earth got me from this little island in New Zealand across to this big island of Australia. And my childhood in Auckland, after I'd been in Auckland, I travelled down to Dunedin for university. Then I worked in New Zealand in Christchurch and Queenstown as a lawyer before thinking, oh, I reckon I could swim in a bigger pond, and I'm just a tiny bit sick of ski instructors and raft guides. So I headed off over to Melbourne, and I'd actually been admitted to the bar in Melbourne within a few months of being admitted in Auckland, so I must have known that eventually I would end up practicing law in Australia. That's a picture of our father, and we all know him by his crazy eyebrows, and you'll hear a bit more about him later on. This is our mother and my children when they were very small at the beach house in New Zealand, and the picture on the right is my brother Mike and my sister Sue and my other sister Anne, who's Audrey's mum, and my son Ian and me at mum and dad's house. I was the first lawyer in a fairly medical family. So here's how I got curious about franchising. First of all, when I was negotiating contracts for A&P shopping centres. So we negotiated the first McDonald's lease in a shopping centre in Australia. And after a while, the centre managers would ring and they would say, who do we serve the notice on? The person who's in the shop isn't the person who's on the lease. And the penny dropped with me that the person who was in the shop was a franchisee, and that the franchisee wasn't the tenant that we had given the lease to. So I began to think this is a very interesting and different relationship that bears a bit of investigation. Needless to say, I got bored with retail leasing after not very long. So I did a master's degree at Melbourne Uni. And in my master's, I took a really good look at the relationship between franchisors and franchisees and how the law saw it. And I did not like what I saw one little bit. After that, we moved to Sydney and in 1995, and I was still working for law firms at this time. The firm I worked for, and my client, in fact, was Mobil Oil, which, of course, had a lot of petrol stations, which were franchised, and ran a lot of distributorships. I wasn't that fired up about doing Mobil Oil franchising agreements either, to be really honest, but I became really curious about alternative dispute resolution. So I did a diploma of dispute resolution at University of Western Sydney, and the lights started to go on. Tanya Sorden, who you see in the top of this picture here, is now the Dean of Law at Newcastle University. In those days, she was running an absolutely inspiring program of dispute resolution at University of Western Sydney. And I was, I think, her guinea pig. She said to me one day, you've got one course you've got left to do. How about doing it in our new course about empirical legal research? Well, the die was cast. I just thought, this is really pretty fantastic, actually digging around behind the situation, not just skimming around through the cases. So I decided I didn't want to be a lawyer anymore. I'd been a transactional lawyer by this time for nearly 20 years. And to be honest, and Brian and I were discussing this before, the carrots that law firms, particularly big law firms, are able to hold out to people, to young lawyers, are basically partnership and money. And if you're not fired up by partnership or money to the extent that you need to be a partner in a big law firm, at some point you decide it's not for you. I spoke to a few friends who were partners in law firms, and the view was that in order to be really happy in a big law firm, you had to want to swim in a tank of piranhas, and you had to be really happy doing that, or you had to be avaricious and paranoid. And that doesn't really describe me. Anybody who knows me, I think, will say that I didn't fit the mould. I didn't want to turn into a swimming in a tank of piranhas, and I wasn't avaricious and paranoid, so it was better that I get out. So I did try mediation for a while, and that wasn't for me either. Then I had a year working in antitrust compliance for big non-compliant companies. And really, they got themselves into that mess. I was able to help them get out, but it wasn't really going to be a very fulfilling way to spend the rest of my working career. So I needed to do something more meaningful. And that's when I came to UNSW. 2002, by quite coincidence, Ansett failed that year. Ansett Airlines had 270 franchisees in the form of travel agencies. And it was a little bit coincidental, but my career as an academic started as this very significant franchise chain failed. So the head of school, when I went for my interview, who's now not here at UNSW, he wasn't put off. He asked me why I wanted to be an academic. Chris, block your ears. And I said to him, I just want a job. I said, we've got a career in our family already, and I didn't think at that stage that you could have 2 careers in a family, so a job would do me fine. Well, I guess I got really hooked on the career thing because I really did take to this being an academic really, really happily. So we've ended up with 2 careers in the family, despite my intentions. But it was interesting. I found myself in a law school or in a business school in a law department where doctrinal research was the norm. And I'd had a taste of empirical research. And I knew from my mediation experience that there was a whole lot more beyond simply what you read in the cases, and that most of what happens in the law happens not in the cases. It happens in all the other areas which really lead you into the cases. So, realising that judgments only formed a really small window, I committed myself to trying to do empirical research in legal problems. And the legal problem that I fixed in was franchisor failure and how franchisors and franchisees fared, particularly franchisees, when their franchisor failed. CPA Australia's up here because Judy Harcher was the then research officer for CPA Australia, and she encouraged me to apply for my first grant and in fact funded me to do my first research on franchisor failure quite a long time ago now. So on the left here you'll see the Federal Court with a bunch of judges, and just beneath that you'll see all the documents ready to run a day in the court. In fact, it was one of the Yum Brands cases that ran earlier this year. And it kind of reinforced my view that actually I didn't want to spend my life milling through court cases. But it was very interesting and very inspiring sitting in on a day because I got an idea for an ARC grant that Rob and I are going to apply for. So that was a really cool day and really worthwhile. Anyway, I thought, gosh, I'm in a business school, and then the rumour in those days was that you had to have a PhD to be a cleaner in the business school. Now, that was a slight exaggeration, but I thought I'd better get a PhD. So there's my supervisor, Stephen Coronis, who is a very esteemed competition lawyer up at QUT, and Ros Mason, who was then the head of the law school. I also have John Piggott to thank for smoothing my path to being allowed to do my PhD at QUT, which had the most suitable supervisors for my particular crazy subject. Now, we're going to show a video that's on the Sydney Morning Herald website. Many franchises, like 7-Eleven and Hungry Jack's, will be well known to you, but you might be surprised to find others, like IKEA and Hilton Hotels, are franchises too. Australia has about 1,200 franchisors and over 70,000 franchisees. So how does it work? A franchisor develops a business, irons out the bugs, clones it, then appoints franchisees. The franchisees get a license for a fixed term and sometimes a specific territory. Franchisees pay an upfront fee of say $50,000, and once they get going, they pay a monthly royalty and other levies. Franchisors provide ongoing support. At the end of the term, the franchisee has no right to continue trading. This is just like when we take a lease on an apartment. We have no right to stay when the lease expires. There is some protection for franchisees. Franchisors need to comply with the Franchising Code of Conduct. 14 days before you commit, the franchisor will give you a disclosure document and various other documents so you can do due diligence. That's homework. Due diligence can be tricky. For instance, there's no franchise register in Australia, and it's hard to find out who's in the franchisor's network of companies. A franchisor might be run by a trust, so it's also hard to find whether someone dodgy is behind that trust. Due diligence is a snapshot of now. The concept might be a fad, like cupcakes. As a franchisee, you'll need to be confident that the franchisor will reinvent the brand before the fad fades. All the literature recommends exhaustive due diligence, but that might not be possible. A third of franchisors start franchising before they've been operating for 12 months. They're not really selling a proven concept. The next point is super important because even some experts aren't aware of its implications. It's important for the franchisee to ask how the money flows between itself and the franchisor. Usually, franchisees receive their customers' money, bank it, then pay the franchisor. However, sometimes the customer's money goes straight to the franchisor's account, then the franchisor pays the franchisee. Franchisees have to work out how they can protect themselves in case their only source of revenue, the franchisor, doesn't pay. It can only take a few days for poor cash flow to destroy a business. A last thing to remember is that the franchisor itself might go under. If this happens, the law offers franchisees no protection. The franchisor's administrator or liquidator owes the franchisees nothing. Their businesses will be evaluated as assets or liabilities and treated accordingly. As for how many franchisors actually succeed or fail, there are no reliable figures. You will have to trust your instincts. I suggest that if you are thinking of becoming a franchisee, you listen to your professional advisors carefully before ditching your day job. If all the ducks line up, you'll find yourself owning a great business. Rightio. So I've identified a few of the challenges in franchising now. The franchisor's mantra is that both parties are business people, franchisees can negotiate their terms, and they can protect themselves. That's rubbish. One of my mentors, Ted Thomas, put his finger on why franchisors the world over resist legislative intervention in the franchise concept. For him, the law of contract has the greatest impact on interactions where freedom of choice and action and freedom from interference are most coveted. Through franchise agreements, franchisors dictate the terms on which they are prepared to do business, so they protect their own interests. And as Canadian Les Stewart has noted, much of the marketing systems is there to put the candidates' risk aversion mechanisms to sleep. The franchisee's choice in the end is take it or leave it. That's why being able to do due diligence is really important, and that's why not having a searchable public database where franchisees can compare one offering against another is also really important. And this does exist in 3 states in the US, so there's no reason why we can't have it here. The idea of corporate governance is also really important. A franchisor is responsible, of course, through its own corporation to its own shareholders, but it's not responsible to its franchisees other than whatever responsibility is there in the contract. And the director's duties trump that the franchisor's director owes its own shareholders, trump any contractual obligations that they have to franchisees or anybody else that they've got a contract with. Franchisees cannot defend their business if the franchisor fails for a whole bunch of reasons, and you can see some of them there. basically the contract really nobbles them into position, and the rights that the liquidators have to even get very long extensions of time to conduct the administration mean that they're jammed into the business until it suits the administrator to make the next move, which may be to keep them in place for 9 months while they clear out a rubbishy stock that the franchisors have accumulated. Now, the Angus and Robertson failure debunks one of the other myths of franchising. You can see that Angus and Robertson, established 1886, failed in 2011. So it's not just new franchisors that fail, it's sometimes very long established ones. And this is Angus and Robertson fitted within this corporate framework. This, although you won't be able to read it properly, is a venture capitalist that assembled a group of 3 franchised brands, so Borders in Singapore, Which Calls in New Zealand, and Angus and Robertson here. And they overextended themselves to purchase into the Borders franchise. And in the end, as soon as the Borders franchise failed in the US, within 1 day, the whole house of cards had come down in Australia. So 3 brands all basically simultaneously came to an end, with all the franchisees attached to them, being exposed to some very, very challenging times. So this is another of these failed franchisors, which ultimately was bought out by one of the other pizza brands. And this slide talks about many of the reasons why franchisors do fail. So some of my research has been trying to understand, can the franchisees do anything about it? Can they protect themselves? And really the short answer is no, because these reasons are all associated with franchisor decisions. And probably the most problematic of all franchisor decisions for a franchisee is what we call strategic insolvency. It's perfectly legitimate. In terms of when you're a liquidator, it's a perfectly legitimate strategy when you're a company, but it's a very difficult strategy for a franchisee because you might be a unit that the franchisor is looking to eliminate. You might fit into this assisting a franchisor to just reconfigure their business. And in reconfiguring, in fact, the franchisor might cast the franchisees adrift, which is not what the franchisees paid and signed up for. So, my ongoing research. Since 2010, when I got this jolly PhD that I decided I needed to have, I've been chipping away at this wicked problem, which is franchisor failure, and how should franchisees be treated. But I'm not alone. I'm really happy. I've now been concentrating on building teams. So Uri Ben Alil is from Israel, and he and I are looking at optimism bias. And Michael Shaper's from the ACCC here in Australia. He and I have been looking at policy and regulation. Courtney Atwell is at the back, and she very kindly brought her brand new baby. So my family's the furthest away, but Courtney's got the youngest member here, I'm absolutely sure. So Courtney's been looking at rights to leave a franchise at certain times. So these are, anyway, there's all my others. Gahan Gunasakara is from Auckland Uni, and you can see him there making a curry in our kitchen. So a really important feature of some of your research collaborators is they have to be able to make a wicked good curry. So we've got Paul Omar from the UK. I've got Rob here, one of my colleagues, who's I'm delighted to say I've finally actually got a colleague that likes to do research in my crazy field. And Diane Welsh has just arrived from the US as well. So she and I are looking forward to doing research that includes family businesses and franchises. Franchise education takes me to the MOOC. And the MOOC was an amazing experience. I do love teaching people about franchising, and it's really relevant for business students and for law students. You're inevitably going to encounter a franchise, not just when you go in to buy a burger or get somebody to clean your house. I did love creating the MOOC, which was really well supported by UNSW. I worked with a fantastic team from Iris Pictures, who prepared all the documentaries, lawyers from Australia, and Peter Bubris is here, so thank you, Peter, for participating in this crazy adventure. And I had also lawyers from Canada, France, the US and the UK participating. I had students, and I included students in making my videos, and I had professional actors and the professional and technical staff from UNSW. And Margaret is somewhere here, so thank you so much, Margaret, for helping me with my amazing MOOC and continuing to help me with my franchise education online. And I must say, working with the UNSW professional and technical staff gave me an amazing appreciation of what an extraordinary contribution they make. We simply couldn't do our academic research without the wonderful input from our professional and technical staff. So thank you to any other P&T staff who are here. Before I close, I want to just say a little bit more about my family. So Kiwis do, I'm a Kiwi, I'm also an Australian, so you're absolutely safe. I will not be relinquishing my Australian citizenship or my New Zealand citizenship. I will never go near our government. But every morning I call into my local cafe and I buy a coffee and I have a chat. Our friend Jan, who couldn't be here today, always keeps us very grounded. And Rob's here this morning, he's one of my coffee mates, and he may remember Jan. When I told my cafe mates at the end of 2010 that I'd got my PhD, Jan piped up with the information that one of our local bachelor friends, who we all think is a wee bit sleazy, had just announced to her that he had a PhD, and he thought that was a big draw card. And she just had the ultimate put down. She turned around and she said to this poor fellow, half of Birchgrove's got a PhD. So this poor man slunk away with his tail between his legs. I don't think we've seen much of him since then. Anyway, my family's always been there for me. So my sister Sue and my brother Mike are here, and my niece Audrey, and thank you very much for coming over. So is my daughter Tamsin, who has been an unfailing supporter, always encouraging me, always believing in me. Thank you, Tamsin. And her wonderful boyfriend Jono is doing the same for her, and he's come up today from Melbourne with Tamsin. My son Ian is somewhere around, and as Brian's already said, he's graduating tonight with his degree in Mandarin. But why not jump into a BSc in Maths and Physics next year? So he's starting again with a BSc from the beginning of next year, which is really exciting. And our dad was the champion of never stop learning. He was a real character. When he was already in his 80s, two things really stand out to me. He was sitting there one day in his chair at home with his Mandarin books on his knee. And his dear friend Ted Thomas, who I mentioned before, who was actually a retired judge, called around to Dad, and he said to Dad, "What are you doing there, George?" "I'm learning Mandarin." So Ted says to Dad, "George, I've got it on good authority. God is not a Chinaman." So Dad kept on learning Mandarin, of course. The other thing that he did, which really did impress us all, I think, was that he was a pathologist, and he was still enrolled in doing the Johns Hopkins online pathology education right up until the time that he died. So that was Dad. Now, Graham's my husband, and he's been super supportive through my changes of career and my numerous weekends sitting here in my office while he was a single parent and I was grafting away at my PhD to try and get the darn thing knocked off as quickly as possible. So thank you, Graham. Thank you, family, for putting up with it. Mum had some tough health issues, but she never complained and she never dropped the ball. She was a great mother and she was a great wife. So maybe I inherited a bit of a stoic gene for her. That may be what put me in that small boat going across the Southern Ocean down to the Falklands with a bunch of almost strangers. Now, Dad was also a perfect example of the rather understated Kiwi humour. We've got a picture of roses here because as a fairly small child, I remember Dad taking us all into the secret. He took some potatoes with eyes in them and he planted them in Mum's rose garden. And he swore us all to secrecy, and we just quietly watched and waited until the potatoes grew in amongst the roses. So we all had a great time there. And why have you got a picture of me snowshoeing in the Chartreuse National Park in the middle of the winter in France. Well, I tell you what, there's not a franchise in sight. And by the time I've finished with my research, I won't be chasing franchises anymore, but I've got quite a lot more research to do. So thank you all for coming here today, and thanks Chris and thanks Brian.
Well, it's my very great pleasure to say the vote of thanks for Jenny. I think if anyone come here and the title had been advertised, the franchisor-franchisee relationship, and you hadn't known Jenny, you might be forgiven for a little bit thinking that this is dry. But I think it's the mark of someone who has reached the top of their academic career to make this informative, educational, entertaining, and inspirational. I'm going to be out on the front line with Fair Go for franchisees with you, Jenny, very shortly. And I think the quality that we've seen in terms of Jenny's not only academic erudition and bringing to bear real-world experiences, but identifying a plight of a group of people. And not only that plight, but making it really important. This is about impact, that we would like all our academics to be able to demonstrate impact in the real world and supporting people. Jenny, you have displayed many of the fundamental behaviours in terms of respect, collaboration, excellence and innovation in your talk today. For that and for your career at UNSW and for everything that's to come. You've been Simpson Desert, you've been to the South Georgia, you've been snowshoeing in Chartreuse. There's a sort of alliterative thing next. I don't know where next you will go, but wherever it will be spectacular. Thank you very much. I'd like you to thank Jenny again.